In the climate-controlled vault of the British Museum, beneath layers of modern London, sits a clay tablet that contains instructions no priest should have possessed. Catalogue number K2950, 7th century BC, excavated from the ruins of Nineveh's Royal Library. The cuneiform is dense, methodical, procedural. 8 columns of text spread across a surface roughly the size of your hand. The clay is cool to touch, surprisingly heavy, marked with the pressure of a reed stylus pressed 4,000 years into wet earth, before fire transformed intention into permanence. The tablet is part of a series called Makal, burning. Not metaphorical burning, actual fire. The instructions are explicit. Take a figurine, speak these exact words in this exact order, burn the image at this precise moment of night. And the text promises something that should be impossible, that through this procedure a mortal priest could redirect the attention of divine beings, could intercept what the gods had decreed, could resist. This is not a prayer, it is not a plea, it is a technical manual. And if you pause right now and comment where you're watching from, whether you're in Sao Paulo or Sydney, Jakarta or Detroit, listening as the sun rises or as the city sleeps, you're part of something the priests of Mesopotamia understood deeply. That knowledge, once written, once spoken, once remembered, does not belong to gods alone. It transfers, it moves, it persists in the hands of those who read the words and understand their weight. The British Museum does not advertise K2950. It sits in academic publications, referenced in footnotes, studied by specialists in Akkadian language and ancient Near Eastern religion. The mainstream interpretation is careful, measured, safe. These were rituals of psychological comfort, symbolic actions to make priests feel they had agency in a world controlled by capricious deities. Theatre for the frightened, performance for the powerless. But the tablet does not read like theatre, it reads like engineering. Consider what it actually says. Tablet the 8th of the Makal series contains a complete manual for an all-night ceremony. The text specifies the hour, after sunset, before dawn. It lists materials with the precision of a recipe. It names divine forces by title and function. And then, in the methodical Akkadian that characterized Mesopotamian ritual literature, it explains how a human being, standing in a temple courtyard under desert stars, could perform actions that would cause those divine forces to alter their course. The word used is not pray to or beg. The verb is closer to bind, to constrain, to redirect through procedure what was previously understood as will. If this were an isolated text, it could be dismissed. But K2950 is not alone. It sits within a vast corpus of tablets, hundreds excavated, thousands estimated to remain beneath the sands of Iraq, that collectively describe a system, a body of knowledge, a technical literature that the priesthood of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon and Assyria preserved, copied, transmitted and protected across millennia as civilization rose and fell and rose again. This literature has a name in Sumerian, Udukul, evil demons, in Akkadian Utuklemtu, but the texts themselves blur boundaries that modern readers expect to find clear. They speak of demons, yes, but also of divine messengers, of forces sent by gods, of the Anunnaki's enforcers, and the procedures described do not differentiate. The method for expelling a demon and the method for deflecting a divine curse use the same ritual architecture, the same language, the same operational logic. What if the priests of Mesopotamia knew something that we have forgotten in our eagerness to separate religion from magic, worship from technique, mythology from memory? What if they preserved knowledge not of how to serve the gods, but of how to survive them? This is not a comfortable question. It challenges the foundation of how we understand ancient religion, as primitive people projecting their fears onto cosmic forces they could not control. But the tablets themselves suggest a different story. They suggest that control was never simple, that authority was never absolute. that the relationship between the Anunnaki and the humans who wrote their names in clay was more complex, more contested, more technical than we have been willing to consider. We begin with a tablet in a vault. We will end with a question that has no simple answer, but between beginning and end, we will follow the evidence where it leads, through ritual manuals and protective amulets, through incantations carved in stone, and procedures written in the margins of texts that scholars still struggle to fully translate, through a body of knowledge that the priests called sacred, but treated as operational. The Sumerians did not invent writing to record history, they invented it to record transactions. Lists, inventories, who owned what, who owed whom, the movement of grain from warehouse to temple, temple to palace, palace to the people who worked the fields under the god's nominal authority but the king's actual control. Writing was accounting before it was literature. It was procedure before it was poetry. And when that same culture turned its scribal precision toward the divine, something interesting happened. The gods were listed, their attributes enumerated, their relationships mapped in genealogies as complex as any royal lineage, and their interactions with humanity were recorded not in the language of mystery and awe, but in the language of contract and clause, condition and consequence, action and result. The tablets from Nippur, from Uruk, from Eridu, the cities the Sumerians themselves said existed before the flood, these tablets do not primarily contain myths, they contain procedures. Rituals detailed with the same precision used to record the movement of barley and silver, and embedded in those procedures is a pattern that academic scholarship acknowledges but rarely emphasizes. The priests knew how to push back. K2950 sits in the British Museum, tagged and catalogued and available to researchers who fill out the proper forms. But it is not displayed in the Mesopotamia Gallery, where tourists photograph the lion hunt reliefs and the reconstructed gates of Babylon. It waits in storage, in the company of thousands of other tablets that together tell a story that does not fit comfortably into the narrative we prefer about ancient religion. That story begins not with the tablet, but with what the tablet assumes its reader already knows. It begins with the framework, the cosmology, the hierarchy, the rules that governed how divine and mortal worlds intersected. And it begins with a question that the Mesopotamians asked differently than we do. Not do the gods exist? But given that they exist, what do we do about it? The answer preserved in tablets like K2950 is more sophisticated than worship, more practical than prayer, and far more unsettling than either. It is knowledge, systematic, transmissible, operational knowledge about forces that called themselves divine, and the procedures that humans could employ to negotiate, redirect, or, in specific, carefully defined circumstances, resist their will. That knowledge did not originate with the priests who wrote it down. The tablets themselves say so. They trace it backward through lineages of learning to a time before the cities were rebuilt, before the flood that scattered civilization and forced survivors to begin again. They trace it to the Apkallu, the seven sages, the wise ones who came before, who taught what we would have to relearn, who left in the hands of the priesthood something that the gods themselves had reason to fear, the knowledge of how their own systems worked, the mechanisms, the procedures, the words that, spoken correctly at the correct time with the correct materials, could intercept what even the Anunnaki had decreed. This is not mythology. This is what the tablets say. And the question we must ask is not whether we believe it, but what the priests believed, what they preserved, and why they treated this knowledge as the most carefully guarded inheritance of their entire civilization. The vault in London is climate-controlled, carefully monitored, preserved for future scholarship. K2950 will outlast us all. The clay remains. The words remain. And in those words, pressed into earth before kingdoms we remember rose and fell, is a record of something that challenges everything we assume about the relationship between divine power and human agency in the ancient world. We will read what they wrote, we will follow the procedures they preserved, and we will ask the question they answered in ritual and repetition across 3,000 years of continuous civilization. What if knowledge, once given, cannot be fully taken back? What if the procedures, once taught, remain operational regardless of who performs them? What if resistance was never about strength, but about knowing which words to speak into the fire as the divine forces gathered in the darkness beyond the temple walls? The tablet waits. The story it tells requires patience, precision, and a willingness to take the priests of Mesopotamia at their word, not as primitive believers, but as systematic practitioners of knowledge they claimed was older than their cities, older than the flood, preserved from a time when the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity was something different than worship, something negotiated, something contested, something that left in mortal hands the ability to say, under specific circumstances with specific procedures, a word that the gods themselves would recognize. No, before the flood came knowledge. The University of Pennsylvania Museum holds tablet CBS 10673, excavated from Nippur between 1889 and 1900. Old Babylonian period, approximately 1600 BC, though the story it preserves is far older. The tablet is fragmentary, about 2/3 lost to time, damage, the casual violence of 4 millennia. What remains is written in Sumerian, the language that predated Akkadian, the language that the Babylonians themselves considered ancient. The text is known to scholars as the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian flood story, and in its fragmentary lines is a detail that academic translations note but rarely emphasize. Before the flood came, the god Enki warned a man named Ziusudra, but Enki had taken an oath with the other Anunnaki not to interfere. He had agreed to let the flood proceed, to let humanity be destroyed, to reset what the senior gods considered a failed experiment. So Enki could not speak directly to Ziusudra. The text is explicit about this constraint. Divine oath bound even divine will. Instead, Enki spoke to a wall, a reed wall in Ziusudra's dwelling. The god addressed the wall in a voice loud enough for the man standing on the other side to hear every word. He told the wall how to build a boat, what dimensions, what materials, how long the rains would last, how to survive what was coming. This is not merely clever, it is procedural. Enki found a method, a technicality, a workaround, a way to transmit information without breaking the letter of his oath. He spoke to a wall. The wall did not prevent Ziusudra from hearing. The other gods could not claim Enki had violated his word. He had not spoken to the human, he had spoken to architecture. CBS 10673 preserves this memory in Sumerian cuneiform, copied and recopied by scribes who treated the text as sacred history, not mythology, history. The story of how knowledge crossed a boundary that divine decree had supposedly sealed. How information, once possessed by gods, moved into human hands through procedure, through technicality, through the careful exploitation of rule and oath and system. And this was not the first time. The tablet itself places this event in sequence. Before the flood came kingship, before kingship came cities, before cities came the Mies, the divine decrees, the fundamental patterns that structured civilization itself. And before all of this, before the first city was founded, came the Apkallu, the 7 sages, the wise ones, the transmitters of antediluvian knowledge. The Apkallu appear across Mesopotamian literature with remarkable consistency for mythological figures. They are always 7. They always predate the flood. They are always associated with Enki, the god of wisdom, the god of the deep fresh waters under the earth, the god who controlled the Mes and taught what needed to be taught to ensure civilization could begin, and after the flood, begin again. Cuneiform texts from Uruk, from the Seleucid period nearly 2,000 years after the Sumerian Golden Age, still preserve lists of the Apkallu by name: Uana, Uanaduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalana, Enmebuluga, and Enlilda, Utuabzu, each associated with one of the antediluvian kings, each serving as counselor, as sage, as bearer of knowledge, from the divine realm to the mortal. The texts describe them as fishmen, as creatures part human and part something else, as beings who could move between the depths where Enki dwelt and the surface where humans built their cities. In palace reliefs from Assyria, they appear as protective figures, flanking doorways, winged, sometimes fish-bodied, carrying the cone and bucket used in purification rituals. They are carved into stone as guardians, as bearers of sacred procedure, as the source of what the priesthood would later systematize into the ritual texts we excavate from ruins. And what did they teach? The tablets are explicit. They taught the Mies, the divine decrees, the fundamental patterns that allowed civilization to function. But more specifically, they taught what we would call applied knowledge, how to build temples according to proper proportion, how to perform rituals at correct times with correct materials, how to speak words that would accomplish effects in the world because the words aligned with underlying structure, underlying system, underlying cosmic procedure. This is not primitive superstition. This is something stranger. The Mesopotamians understood their civilization as proceeding from instruction, from knowledge transmitted downward by beings who possessed it before humanity existed in its current form. And they preserved this framework across millennia, through the collapse of kingdoms, through foreign conquest, through the replacement of Sumerian with Akkadian with Aramaic. The story remained, the Apkallu remained, the memory of instruction remained. Academic scholarship treats this as origin mythology. Every culture claims divine origin for its knowledge. The Greeks had Prometheus bringing fire and arts. The Egyptians had Thoth inscribing wisdom for humanity. The Mesopotamian version is merely their cultural variant. 7 sages from a god of wisdom teaching civilization to survivors of catastrophe. But there is a difference in emphasis. Prometheus is punished by Zeus for his gift. The knowledge is stolen, transgressive, the cause of divine rage. Thoth operates within Egyptian cosmic order, recording what Ma'at requires. But the Apkallu are commissioned. They are sent by Enki deliberately to ensure that humans possess what they need, not merely to survive, but to operate within divine systems with understanding of how those systems work. Consider what this implies about the relationship between divine and mortal in Mesopotamian thought. The gods did not want humans ignorant, or rather one faction of the gods, represented by Enki, god of wisdom and deep knowledge, ensured that humans would not remain ignorant even when other gods preferred it so. The flood narrative is explicit. Enlil, chief of the gods, wanted humanity destroyed because they had become too numerous, too noisy, too problematic. The other Anunnaki agreed. Divine consensus settled on extermination. But Enki disagreed, and Enki possessed the knowledge of how systems worked, including divine systems, including oaths, including the procedures that bound even gods who claimed ultimate authority. So he spoke to a wall. He transmitted knowledge through technicality. He ensured that the flood would not mean the permanent loss of what the Apkallu had taught. CBS 10673 is fragmentary, but what remains places this event as pivotal. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again. Cities were rebuilt. But the knowledge did not have to be reinvented. It was preserved. Ziusudra survived. And with him survived the memory of what the Apkallu had taught, what Enki had transmitted, what humanity needed to know to function in a world where divine forces existed and exerted will, but were not, themselves beyond system and procedure. This is the framework the priesthood inherited. This is what they believed about their own knowledge. Not that they had invented rituals to comfort themselves. Not that they were performing symbolic actions to create psychological meaning, but that they were custodians of instruction that predated the cities they served, instruction that came from beings who understood divine operation from the inside, instruction that was preserved precisely because it was functional, operational, necessary for survival in a cosmos where there. Anunnaki, were real, and their authority was not automatically benevolent. The tablets from Nippur, from Ur, from Babylon, the ritual texts, the incantation series, the procedural manuals that scholars catalogue as magic, these texts do not present themselves as human invention. They trace their authority backward. The most powerful rituals are attributed to Enki. The most effective incantations are said to have been taught by the Apkallu. The procedures are framed not as discovered, but as transmitted, preserved, guarded as the most valuable inheritance of the priesthood. And what those procedures describe, again and again across hundreds of tablets and thousands of years of continuous transmission, is how to interact with divine forces from a position of knowledge rather than ignorance, how to negotiate rather than merely supplicate, how to employ procedure to achieve effects that divine will alone might not grant, how to resist, when necessary, what even the gods decreed. This challenges the fundamental model we use to understand ancient religion. We assume prayer is petition. We assume ritual is symbolic. We assume that priests mediated between powerless humans and omnipotent gods, translating human need into forms gods might find acceptable. But the Mesopotamian texts suggest a different model. The priests were not merely translators. They were operators, technicians, bearers of knowledge about how divine systems function, knowledge that gave them leverage, procedure, method, knowledge that came from before the flood, from the Apkallu, from Enki, who ensured through technicality that even divine consensus to destroy humanity could not destroy the information necessary for humanity's survival and operation. The British Museum holds thousands of tablets excavated from Nineveh, the library of Ashurbanipal, last great king of Assyria, 7th century BC. The library was assembled deliberately, scribes sent throughout the empire to collect, copy and preserve the knowledge of Mesopotamia before foreign conquest made it vulnerable. Ashurbanipal's library project succeeded. When Nineveh fell in 612 BC, the clay tablets survived in the rubble. Excavated in the 1840s and 50s, shipped to London, they became the foundation for modern understanding of Mesopotamian civilization. Among those tablets are dozens of copies of the Apkallu traditions, lists of the seven sages, descriptions of their functions, references to their teaching. And these texts are not marginal curiosities. They are copied repeatedly, preserved carefully, transmitted as core knowledge that explained where the priesthood's authority and procedure originated. The tradition holds that after the flood, the Apkallu themselves did not return. Their era ended. But they left human successors, scholars, scribes, priests who inherited the knowledge and continued its transmission. The texts list lineages, Umanu, the scholars, the learned ones who succeeded the Apkallu. And these lineages extend from the early post-flood kings through the entire history of Mesopotamian civilization. Every generation produced scholars who learned from the previous generation what the Apkallu had originally taught. This is not unusual in itself. Every literate culture preserves chains of transmission. But the Mesopotamian version makes an unusual claim. It asserts continuity of specific operational knowledge. The rituals performed by 7th century BC Assyrian priests were the same rituals taught by the Apkallu to the first post-flood generation. The procedures had been preserved without fundamental change because they worked based on cosmic structure that had not changed. The words were the same words. The materials were the same materials. The effects were the same effects. Modern skepticism reacts predictably to such claims. Obviously, the rituals evolved. Obviously, later priests projected authenticity backward to authorize their own innovations. Obviously, the knowledge from before the flood is mythological framing for procedures that developed over time through normal cultural processes. But the tablets themselves show remarkable continuity. Rituals described in old Babylonian texts from 1800 BC appear in virtually identical form in Neo-Assyrian texts from 700 BC. Incantations in Sumerian, a dead language by the time of Babylon, continue to be copied, preserved, used in ritual contexts for millennia after anyone spoke Sumerian as a living tongue. The procedures maintain coherence across time, geography, and political upheaval with a consistency that suggests they were treated as fixed, authoritative, transmitted, rather than invented. And the texts themselves explain why. These procedures came from the Apkallu, from before the flood, from the time when divine and mortal interacted directly, when the knowledge was given rather than discovered. To alter the procedures would be to break the chain, to lose the connection to their source, to render them ineffective because their effectiveness derived from their origin in divine instruction. This is what the priesthood believed. This is the framework within which they operated. And it matters, because it shaped what they thought they were doing when they performed rituals that claimed to bind demons, deflect curses, avert divine anger, resist what the gods had decreed. They were not inventing procedures and hoping they worked. They were applying knowledge that had been tested, preserved, transmitted as functional. Knowledge that predated civilization itself. Knowledge that came from beings who understood divine operation because they served the god who possessed the Mes, the fundamental patterns that structured reality itself. CBS 1673 sits in Philadelphia, fragmentary but preserved. The Eridugenesis remains incomplete, the story of the flood broken by missing clay. But what remains is enough. Enki spoke to a wall. Ziusudra heard through the wall. Knowledge crossed a boundary that divine oath had supposedly sealed. The flood came and went. Humanity survived. And with humanity survived the memory that knowledge, once given, does not simply disappear, because those who gave it would prefer to take it back. The Apkallu taught. The knowledge was transmitted. The priesthood preserved what the sages had delivered. And in that preserved knowledge was procedure, specific, detailed, operational procedure for interacting with divine forces in ways that prayer alone could never accomplish, ways that assumed understanding, ways that required technique, ways that, according to the tablets themselves, allowed mortal operators to stand in the presence of divine will and, when necessary, employ procedure to achieve results the gods had not intended to permit. This is not worship, this is operation, and it begins with memory of a time before the flood, when the boundaries between divine and mortal were different, when knowledge flowed downward through deliberate instruction, when the Apkallu walked among humans and taught what civilization would require to function in a cosmos that was structured, systematic, procedural. The priests of Mesopotamia understood themselves as heirs to that instruction, and the rituals they preserved, the incantations they copied, the procedures they guarded, these were not their inventions, these were their inheritance. Knowledge from before the flood. Knowledge that the God of wisdom himself had ensured would survive even when the other Anunnaki decreed destruction. Knowledge that included, among many other things, how to resist what even gods commanded. Because the knowledge came from one who understood that divine authority, like any system, has procedure, and procedure, properly understood and properly executed, can be employed by any operator who possesses the instruction. The tablet in Philadelphia is fragmentary, but fragments can be enough to establish that the Mesopotamian priesthood traced their operational knowledge backward, beyond history, beyond the flood, to a source that claimed authority not from human innovation, but from divine instruction deliberately transmitted. And that transmission, according to the very texts that preserve it, was an act of defiance against divine consensus, Enki speaking to a wall, ensuring that the knowledge would survive, that humanity would retain what the Apkallu had taught. We are heirs to that survival, separated by language, by culture, by millennia and continents. But the tablets remain, the words remain, and in those words is a record of how one civilization understood the relationship between knowledge and power, between divine authority and human operation, between what gods decree and what mortals, properly instructed, might accomplish despite divine decree. The Apkallu came before the flood. The flood did not erase what they taught. The priesthood preserved the knowledge, and that knowledge, according to tablets scattered across museums from Philadelphia to London to Baghdad, included procedures that allowed humans to operate within divine systems with understanding sufficient to negotiate, to deflect, to avert, and when the procedures aligned correctly, to resist. This is the foundation. Everything that follows builds from this memory of instruction from before, from the time when the 7 sages walked between the deep waters and the surface world, bearing knowledge from Enki, the wise, the trickster, the one who found technicalities in divine oaths, and spoke truth to walls, so that humans standing on the other side could hear what they needed to survive. The flood came, the knowledge remained, and with it remained the uncomfortable possibility that the relationship between Anunnaki and humanity was never meant to be simple worship by the powerless directed toward the omnipotent, but something more complex, more negotiated, more technical, more like operation, the divine decrees that could be stolen. The concept appears across Mesopotamian texts with a consistency of fundamental cosmology, me, pronounced May, in Akkadian, Peru, usually translated as divine decrees or divine powers, though neither translation captures the full sense. The me were understood as both objects and principles, physical items that could be held, transferred, stolen, yet also cosmic patterns that structured reality itself. The contradiction does not seem to have troubled Mesopotamian thought. The me were what they were, concrete and abstract simultaneously, possessible yet fundamental. Enki controlled the me. The texts are explicit about this. The god of wisdom, of deep waters, of craft and knowledge, he possessed the comprehensive set of me from his dwelling in the Abzu, the fresh water realm beneath the earth. From there he administered cosmic order, not through direct control, but through the allocation of me to appropriate divine and mortal functionaries. Each me represented a domain, a function, a pattern of civilization or cosmos. Kingship was a me, priesthood was a me, writing, music, metalwork, sexual practice, warfare, judgment, all me, all patterns that proceeded from cosmic structure and manifested in organized activity. This is not primitive thinking, this is systems analysis. The Mesopotamians understood their civilization as running on protocols, on procedures, on structured patterns that had to be maintained according to proper form or the system would malfunction. And they understood these patterns as having origin outside human invention. The me existed before humans employed them. They were discovered, not created. Or more accurately, they were given, transmitted from divine realm to mortal through deliberate allocation by those who controlled cosmic structure, primarily by Enki. Which raises the question the texts themselves explore: if divine power is contained in possessible objects, what happens when those objects change hands? The story of Inanna and Enki addresses this directly. Multiple tablet fragments preserve versions, from Sumerian originals to later Akkadian translations. The core narrative remains consistent. Inanna, goddess of Uruk, goddess of love and war, young and ambitious and determined to elevate her city to preeminence, decided she needed the me. Not some of them, all of them. The complete set that Enki guarded in the Abzu. So she went to visit. The texts describe her preparation, adorning herself, making herself beautiful, approaching Enki's dwelling as honoured guest. Enki received her hospitably. He prepared a feast. And he drank. The texts are explicit about this detail. Enki drank beer, not a little. The god of wisdom got drunk. And while drunk, Enki began giving away the me. One after another, he handed them to Inanna. Kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the art of making war, the art of speaking with authority, the art of judging. Over 60 me catalogued in the text, transferred from the god who controlled cosmic order to the goddess who wanted them for her city. When Enki sobered, he discovered what he had done. He sent his vizier to retrieve the me, to take them back by force if necessary. But Inanna had already reached Uruk. She had already installed the me in her temple. The transfer was complete. Enki's attempted recovery failed. The me remained in Uruk. Divine power had changed hands because Enki had been drunk and generous, and Inanna had been cunning and prepared. The story is often read as humorous, the wise god outwitted by a clever goddess, cosmic power transferred through beer and seduction. But the underlying logic is startling. The me could be transferred. Divine authority was not inherent to the gods, but mediated through objects they possessed. Get control of the objects, and you control the authority they represent. The gods were powerful because they possessed the me, not because power was intrinsic to their nature. This has profound implications for how Mesopotamians understood divine authority. It was not absolute in the sense of being inseparable from divine being. It was administrative, operational, based on possession of the proper instruments of cosmic procedure. And instruments, by their nature, can be transferred, stolen, lost, recovered. They are external to their wielder. They grant authority rather than embodying it. Which means, and this is the uncomfortable conclusion the texts themselves suggest, that divine authority was conditional on possession of the mechanisms that authorized it. The Tablet of Destinies makes this even more explicit. Different myths describe it, most famously in the Enuma Elish creation epic and the Anzu myth. The Tablet of Destinies was the supreme me, the object that granted its possessor authority to decree fate, to shape what would be. Originally it belonged to Anu, the sky god, senior most of the Anunnaki, but it did not stay with him. In the Enuma Elish, the tablet passes to Kingu. Tiamat, the primordial goddess preparing for war against the younger gods, gives the tablet to Kingu and makes him commander of her forces. The tablet grants him authority over the Anunnaki, authority to command destiny itself. The younger gods are terrified. They cannot defeat an enemy who possesses the Tablet of Destinies. Only Marduk, armed with winds and storms and cosmic authority, granted specifically for this purpose, manages to kill Kingu and seize the tablet. The Anzu myth describes an earlier incident. Anzu, a divine bird, a storm being, a creature of the gods themselves, steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil while the god is bathing. With the tablet in his possession, Anzu becomes unchallengeable. The gods cannot decree his fate because he controls the instrument of decreeing. Multiple gods attempt to recover the tablet and fail. Finally, Ninurta, god of war, succeeds through cunning and violence. He retrieves the tablet. Divine order is restored, but the vulnerability has been exposed. The supreme authority of the Anunnaki depended on maintaining control of a physical object. Lose the object, and authority itself was compromised. These are not minor myths. These are stories about the fundamental architecture of divine power in Mesopotamian cosmology, and what they reveal is striking. Divine authority was not self-sustaining. It required instruments, physical objects that contained or channeled or authorized the power to decree, to command, to shape reality according to will. And these objects could be lost, stolen, transferred, seized by force or by cunning. The Anunnaki were powerful because they possessed the instruments of power, but possession was not guaranteed. It had to be maintained, protected, guarded against theft or loss, because without the Tablet of Destinies, even Enlil could not decree fate. Without the me, even Enki's wisdom would be unable to structure civilization. The power was in the object, not in the god who held it. Now consider what this framework implies for the priesthood. If divine power operates through instruments, through objects that can be transferred, then the question becomes, which instruments did the gods retain exclusively, and which did they distribute? Which powers remained sealed in divine hands, and which were allocated downward to mortal functionaries who needed them to perform their roles in cosmic and civilizational structure. The texts suggest the distribution was extensive. Kingship was a me given to mortal kings to authorize their rule. Priesthood was a me given to mortal priests to authorize their ritual function. The arts of civilization, writing, metallurgy, agriculture, judgment, warfare, all transmitted from divine realm to mortal through deliberate allocation. The gods did not perform these functions direct. They authorized mortals to perform them by distributing the appropriate me, which means mortals, or at least certain mortals in specific roles, possessed instruments of divine power, not metaphorically, actually. The me they employed in their functions were the same me that resided in Enki's treasury in the Abzu. The kingship exercised by mortal rulers was the same kingship me that Inanna stole and installed in Uruk. The priesthood performed by temple functionaries operated through the same priest me that structured cosmic religious order. And if me could be stolen from Enki by Inanna, if the tablet of destinies could be seized from Enlil by Anzu, then what prevents mortal possessors of me from employing those instruments beyond their intended scope? What constrains the use of divine power once the instruments that channel it are in mortal hands? The answer appears to be procedure, knowledge, understanding of how the instruments work, what they authorize, what they require. The me were not arbitrary magic. They operated according to structure. To employ a me required understanding its nature, its proper domain, its correct invocation. This is why the priesthood spent years in training, why scribes copied ritual texts with obsessive precision, why procedures were preserved unchanged across generations. The me granted power, but wielding that power required knowledge. Knowledge of cosmic structure, ritual procedure, proper invocation. Knowledge that, according to the tablets themselves, came from the Apkallu, from before the flood, from beings who understood divine operation because they served the God who controlled the fundamental patterns of reality. Knowledge that was transmitted, preserved, guarded as the priesthood's most essential inheritance. And here, the framework becomes uncomfortable. If priests possessed me, instruments of divine power, and if they possessed knowledge of how those instruments operated based on cosmic structure, then what they were doing in ritual was not symbolic, it was operational. They were employing divine instruments according to divine procedure to achieve effects in the world, effects that derived their power from the same source as divine effects, from the me, from cosmic structure itself. The mainstream interpretation resists this conclusion. Obviously the priests believed their rituals were effective. Obviously they developed elaborate rationalizations for why they possessed authority, but from a modern perspective they were performing theatre. The me were conceptual frameworks, not physical objects. Divine power was mythological, not operational. The rituals accomplished psychological effects, not cosmic ones. But the texts do not describe psychological effects. They describe specific material results. A demon expelled from a house, a divine curse lifted from a family, an omen of disaster averted before it manifests. The effects are concrete, observable, testable within the Mesopotamian framework. And the procedures are described with the precision of technical manuals because within that framework they were technical manuals. Instructions for operating instruments of cosmic structure to achieve specific effects through proper procedure. Consider the implications if we take the text seriously on their own terms. The priests possessed me. They possessed knowledge of cosmic structure and ritual procedure. They could employ divine instruments to achieve effects that derived from the same authority structure that authorized divine action. They were not outside the system begging for intervention. They were inside the system, operating according to its rules, employing its mechanisms, which means they could, theoretically, employ those mechanisms against divine will. Not because they were more powerful than gods, they clearly were not, but because they understood the system, because the me they possessed were legitimate instruments of that system, because procedure, properly executed, produces effects regardless of whether higher authorities approve of the specific application. This is the pattern that emerges from tablets like K2950, the Mackel series in the British Museum. The ritual described is not a prayer asking gods to remove divine anger. It is a procedure that employs specific me, the me of purification, of fire, of binding, of cosmic order, to redirect divine anger according to proper technique. The priest is not begging, he is operating, employing instruments he legitimately possesses according to knowledge he legitimately inherited from the Apkallu who taught his lineage how cosmic structure functions. The text does not say, please, gods, remove this curse. It says through this procedure, employing these materials, speaking these words at this hour, the curse is redirected according to cosmic principle. The authority claimed is procedural, operational, based on understanding and proper execution of technique. And if this sounds strange, consider that Enki got drunk and gave away the me. Consider that Anzu stole the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil. Consider that Inanna installed stolen me in her temple and successfully defended them against Enki's attempt at recovery. Consider that divine authority in Mesopotamian thought was never portrayed as absolute, unquestionable, immune to challenge or transfer or loss. It was powerful, it was real, but it was systemic, based on instruments, mediated through procedure. The priesthood operated within that same system. They possessed instruments the gods had distributed. They possessed knowledge the Apkallu had taught. They employed both according to procedure refined over millennia of continuous practice. And sometimes, not often, but the texts record it happening, sometimes the procedures allowed them to achieve effects that divine will alone had not authorized. Not because they overpowered the gods, but because they understood the system well enough to operate within it in ways the gods had not anticipated or had not successfully prevented. This is not rebellion. This is not defiance in the sense of opposing divine authority through strength. This is something more subtle and more unsettling. This is operation according to knowledge that divine authority itself had once distributed and could not fully reclaim, because the knowledge was true, the procedures were functional, the me were legitimate instruments of cosmic structure. The story of Inanna and Enki ends with Enki accepting the transfer. He does not destroy Uruk. He does not strip Inanna of the me she took while he was drunk. The transfer, however it occurred, was legitimate once completed. The me were in Inanna's possession. She installed them according to proper procedure. They became part of Uruk's cosmic authority. Enki's regret did not invalidate the transaction. This is Mesopotamian divine politics, concrete, procedural, based on possession and proper execution rather than abstract justice or moral right. And if this is how gods related to each other, through possession of instruments, through procedure, through transfer that could not be undone once properly completed, then the priesthood operated in the same framework, not as outsiders begging for mercy, as participants employing legitimately possessed instruments according to legitimately inherited knowledge. The me could be stolen, the Tablet of Destinies could be seized, divine authority could be challenged, transferred, lost, recovered, not easily, not without consequence. But the possibility existed within the system itself. The architecture of divine power in Mesopotamian thought included vulnerabilities, procedures, technicalities that could be exploited by those who understood how the system worked. And the priesthood understood, because they were taught, by lineages that trace back to the Apkallu, by texts that preserve procedures with obsessive precision, by training that took years, because the knowledge was complex, systematic, operational. Knowledge of how me functioned, how rituals employed them, how cosmic structure could be engaged, not through prayer alone, but through procedure that derived its authority from the same source as divine authority itself. Inanna got Enki drunk and walked away with a comprehensive set of me. The story is recorded, copied, preserved across centuries, not as a warning against cunning goddesses, but as a demonstration of principle. Divine power operates through instruments. Control the instruments, and you control the power they channel. This is not secret knowledge. This is foundational Mesopotamian cosmology, recorded in their myths, embedded in their rituals, preserved in tablets scattered across museums today. The question is not whether the priests believed this. The texts make clear they did. The question is what they did with this belief, how they employed the framework, what procedures they developed and preserved for operating within a divine system that they understood to be real, powerful, and based on instruments and knowledge rather than arbitrary will. The answer waits in tablets like K2950, in ritual series like Makal and Urpu and Betir Rimki, in procedures preserved with technical precision across millennia, procedures that do not read like prayers, that read like operation manuals, like technical literature for practitioners who possess instruments, who understand cosmic structure, who have inherited knowledge from before the flood about how to engage divine power, not as supplicants, but as operators. The me could be stolen. The texts say so. And if they could be stolen by gods, from gods, then the question the priesthood explored in their ritual literature is, what can be done by mortals who possess me legitimately, who understand cosmic procedure, who employ divine instruments according to knowledge that the gods themselves once distributed and cannot fully revoke? The answer requires understanding the specific procedures, the ritual architecture, the technical literature preserved in tablets that academic scholarship catalogues as magic, but that present themselves as something more systematic, more procedural, more operational. We turn now to those procedures, to the architecture of sacred defence, to the methods by which Mesopotamian priests employed knowledge and instruments to create spaces, conditions, effects that even divine would struggle to break. Not through power, through procedure, through understanding, through operation according to cosmic structure that predated even the gods who claimed to control it. The me were the key, and the key had been distributed, possessed, employed by mortals who understood, perhaps better than the gods preferred, exactly what possession of divine instruments made possible when wielded by hands trained in their use. The architecture of sacred defence. The series is known to scholars as Bit Rimki, House of the Ablution Bath. 7 tablets, possibly more. The series is reconstructed from fragments found across multiple excavation sites: Nineveh, Assur, Babylon. The rituals described are complex, expensive, requiring days of preparation and precise execution. They were not performed casually. These were procedures for consecrating space, for transforming ordinary architecture into defended territory, for creating environments where specific forces, demonic or divine, could not enter without confronting barriers woven from procedure itself. The tablets describe the construction of protective architecture in methodical detail. First, the space must be purified. Water from specific sources, river water, well water, water that has touched neither earth nor vessel made by human hands. The boundaries are marked, lines drawn with flour, with oil, with materials specified in the text. At each boundary point, an incantation. At each threshold, a procedure. The text does not explain why these materials or why these words. It assumes the practitioner knows, assumes the knowledge has been transmitted through proper training. Then come the figurines, small images fashioned from clay, from wood, from precious materials when the patron could afford them. Images of protective beings. Apkallu with their cone and bucket. Lamassu, the winged human-headed bulls. Ugolu, the lion-headed eagle. These were not decorations. The ritual text described them as operators, beings whose function was defence, whose presence in proper position according to proper procedure would intercept intrusive forces before they could penetrate the protected space. The figurines were buried under thresholds, at corners, in walls. The tablets specified depth, orientation, accompanying materials. A figurine buried incorrectly would not function. The procedure required precision because the protection derived not from the image itself, but from the proper integration of the image into spatial structure according to cosmic principle. The figurine was an anchor point, a manifestation of protective force installed according to me of defence, me of boundary, me of consecrated space. And once installed, the text claims, these figurines created a defended perimeter. Demonic forces approaching the house would encounter them and be turned away. Divine anger directed at the inhabitants would strike the figurines first, exhaust itself against properly installed protection before reaching its intended target. The architecture itself became active defence because it had been constructed according to procedure that employed cosmic principles. Modern skepticism sees sympathetic magic, psychological comfort, theatre to make inhabitants feel safe in a dangerous world. But the tablets do not describe feelings of safety. They describe measurable effects. A household afflicted by disease employs the Betit Rimki procedure. The disease departs. A family under divine curse installs the figurines according to proper method. The curse manifests elsewhere or dissipates entirely. The effects are concrete within the Mesopotamian framework, and the procedures are described with engineering precision because, within that framework, they were engineering. Consider what the ritual assumes about cosmic structure. It assumes that space can be modified, that boundaries can be strengthened through proper procedure, that protective forces can be installed in specific locations and will function automatically once correctly positioned. It assumes, in other words, that cosmic defense operates according to systematic principles that skilled practitioners can employ to create effects that persist independent of divine will. The house, once consecrated through Bitrimki, maintains its protection until the procedure degrades or is deliberately undone. The gods do not have to continually authorize it. The procedure itself sustains the effect. This is not prayer. Prayer requires ongoing relationship, ongoing divine attention. Prayer is petition that succeeds or fails based on divine decision. But the Betit Rimki procedure, once completed, establishes structure. The protective architecture functions because it has been constructed according to cosmic principle, employing appropriate me, installed by practitioners who possess the knowledge of how spatial defense works at the intersection of material and cosmic realms. The tablets preserved at Nineveh, now scattered between the British Museum and the Iraq Museum, include copies of Betit Rimki from the 7th century BC. But the language includes Sumerian passages, archaisms, technical terms that suggest the rituals are far older. The Neo-Assyrian scribes who copied them were preserving procedures developed centuries or millennia earlier, preserving them because they remained functional, because the cosmic principles they employed had not changed, because the need for spatial defense persisted across generations. And the texts make clear that such defense was necessary precisely because divine forces could be hostile. The procedure explicitly names divine anger among the forces that must be deflected. Not all divine attention was benevolent. Not all divine were aligned with human survival. The gods could decree destruction, could send plague, could direct their anger at individuals or families or cities for reasons that mortals might never understand. And when they did, the Betit Rimki procedure offered defense, not absolute defense. The texts never claim invulnerability, but procedural defense. Defense that operated according to the same cosmic principles that authorized divine action. Defense that could deflect, delay, or redistribute divine force, because it employed proper me according to proper procedure in proper configuration. Defense that worked not by opposing divine power directly, but by channeling it, redirecting it, forcing it to exhaust itself against barriers that had been installed according to cosmic structure itself. This is sophisticated systems thinking. The Mesopotamians understood their cosmos as lawful, not in the sense of moral law, but in the sense of structured operation. Cause produced effect through systematic relationship. Divine power operated through cosmic structure, not in violation of it, which meant that understanding cosmic structure allowed for the construction of defences that even divine power would have to respect, because the defences themselves employed the same principles that made divine power operational. The apotropaic figures, the Apkallu, the Lamassu, the protective beings, appear throughout Mesopotamian art. They flank palace gateways in Assyrian reliefs. They guard temple entrances carved in stone. They are buried under foundations of major buildings discovered by archaeologists excavating throughout Iraq and Syria. These are not mere symbols. Within the Mesopotamian framework, they were functional installations. Protective operators positioned according to procedure that specialists in sacred architecture understood because they had been trained in knowledge inherited from the Apkallu, from before the flood, from the origin point of civilizational wisdom. The British Museum's Assyrian galleries display massive lamassu, human-headed winged bulls that flanked the palace gates at Nineveh and Nimrud. Tourists photographed them as art. Archaeological placards describe them as guardian figures, as symbols of protection, but the ritual texts describe them differently. They describe them as operators whose function was to intercept hostile forces, human armies, yes, but also demonic intrusion, divine malice, any force that approached with destructive intent. The lamassu were installed according to Bitrimke principles. They were not sculptures. They were procedural defence made manifest in stone. The logic extends beyond individual buildings. Cities employed the same principles at larger scale. City walls were not merely physical barriers. They were consecrated according to procedures that transformed them into cosmic boundaries. Rituals performed at foundation, at gates, at corners, at any point where the boundary might be vulnerable. The city itself became a defended space, protected not only by stone and soldiers, but by proper employment of cosmic principle through spatial structure. This is why siege warfare in Mesopotamian texts includes ritual components. An attacking army would bring its own priests, its own procedures for breaking the enemy's cosmic defences. Before battering rams struck walls, rituals were performed to undo the protective procedures that had been woven into those walls. Warfare operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical violence and procedural assault, both necessary because defence had been constructed on both levels. Academic scholarship acknowledges this, but interprets it psychologically. The rituals gave soldiers confidence. The procedures made defenders feel their cause was cosmically authorised. But the texts do not describe psychology. They describe siegecraft. Technical knowledge of how to assault defended space when that defence included cosmic structure deliberately installed by priests who understood spatial protection. And here the pattern becomes clear. The Mesopotamian priesthood did not only mediate between humans and gods, they did not only perform rituals to maintain divine favour, they also possessed technical knowledge of how to construct defences that would function even against divine assault, how to consecrate space so that intrusive forces, regardless of their origin, would encounter barriers, how to employ me of protection, me of boundary, me of spatial structure to create zones where the inhabitants gained advantage through proper procedure. This knowledge was specialised. Not every priest possessed it. The texts refer to the Ipu, the exorcist, the specialist in protective procedure, the practitioner trained specifically in rituals like Bitrimke that modified spatial structure according to cosmic principle. The Ipu underwent extensive training, years of study, memorization of procedures, practice under supervision of established practitioners. This was not folk magic casually learned. This was technical expertise in cosmic architecture, requiring understanding of how space, material and cosmic structure intersected, how proper procedure could modify that intersection to create measurable protective effects. And the Ipu's authority derived from lineage. Texts record their genealogies, chains of teaching extending backward through generations, ultimately traced to the Apkallu, to the original transmitters of this knowledge. An Ipu's power to perform Beat Rimki effectively came not from personal charisma or divine favour, but from proper training in procedures that worked because they were old, because they had been tested across millennia, because they employed cosmic principles that had not changed since thee. Knowledge was first transmitted by beings who understood divine operation from the inside. The tablets describe failures. Not all procedures worked. Sometimes the protective architecture was breached. Disease entered despite consecration. Divine anger struck despite proper defence. The texts acknowledge this, but explain it through procedural error. A boundary line drawn incorrectly, a figurine mispositioned, an incantation spoken with imperfect pronunciation. The cosmic principles remained valid, but human execution introduced error. The solution was not to abandon the procedure, but to execute it more precisely, with better training, under supervision of more experienced practitioners. This is engineering logic. Systems fail when improperly implemented. The response is not to reject the system, but to improve implementation. The Mesopotamian priesthood approached cosmic protection with the same attitude they applied to irrigation engineering or architectural construction. There were principles. Proper application of principles produced effects. Failures indicated implementation problems, not principle problems. The solution was better training, more precise execution, more careful preservation of procedures that had been proven across generations. The Bit Rimki tablets exist because the procedures were important enough to preserve in writing, important enough to copy across centuries, important enough to transmit from Sumerian through Akkadian, from Old Babylonian through Neo-Assyrian, from one kingdom to the next, despite political collapse and cultural change. The procedures themselves remained stable because they were understood to work, and they worked because they employed cosmic structure according to principles that predated any particular kingdom or cultural moment. Principles that, according to the tablet's own framework, came from the Apkallu, from beings who served Enki, god of wisdom, god of cosmic structure, god who possessed the me and distributed them according to his own logic. Enki, who spoke to walls, who found technicalities, who ensured that knowledge humans needed to survive would be preserved even when other gods preferred humans remain ignorant or dependent. The Beat Rimki procedure is Enki's legacy made concrete. It is protective knowledge systematized, preserved, transmitted to a priesthood that understood its role as custodians of wisdom that predated their cities. Wisdom that allowed them to construct defences in space according to cosmic principle. Defences that would function against any intrusive force, demonic or divine, because the defences employed the same cosmic structure that made all force operational. A house consecrated through Beat Rimki became more than residence. It became defended territory. Architecture transformed into active protection through procedure that modified how cosmic forces intersected with physical space. The inhabitants gained advantage not through divine favour, though they might seek that too, but through proper employment of knowledge that their specialists possessed and applied according to training received from lineages extending back to the origin of civilization itself. This is what sacred architecture meant in Mesopotamian practice. Not merely beautiful temples to honour gods, but functional modification of space to create zones where human operation was protected, where intrusion was resisted, where cosmic principles favouring defence had been deliberately installed by specialists who understood how installation worked because they had been taught by teachers whose authority traced through unbroken lineage to the source of the knowledge. The Apkallu taught spatial defence. The priesthood preserved it. The tablets record it. And in those records is a picture of religious practice that sits uncomfortably with modern assumptions. The Mesopotamian priests were not helpless before divine power. They possessed procedures for modifying space to resist intrusion. They employed those procedures as part of normal practice, not as exceptional crisis response. And they understood what they were doing not as symbolic theatre, but as cosmic engineering, the application of technical knowledge about how structure, material, and cosmic principle intersected to produce measurable protective effects. The figurines buried under thresholds in ruins across Iraq and Syria testify to the practice. Archaeologists excavate them regularly. Small clay images of protective beings, positioned according to procedure, buried at points of vulnerability. The houses fell to time, to conquest, to the normal decay of abandoned architecture. But the figurines remain, marking points where ancient practitioners once installed defence according to knowledge they inherited and preserved and employed because they believed, because their entire civilization believed, that such defence was necessary, possible, and operational through proper procedure. The texts do not claim invulnerability, but they claim something almost more striking. They claim that systematic knowledge, properly applied, allowed mortal practitioners to engage cosmic forces on terms that procedure determined rather than divine whim. That space could be modified, that boundaries could be strengthened, that protection could be installed and would function according to its proper nature once installation was complete. This is the architecture of sacred defence, not prayer alone, not sacrifice alone, but procedure, engineering, the systematic application of knowledge about cosmic structure to modify physical and cosmic space simultaneously, to create zones where intrusion was resisted, where inhabitants gained advantage, where even divine forces would have to expend effort to penetrate because the defences had been constructed according to the same principles that made divine force operational in the first place. The BT Rimke tablets preserve this knowledge, fragmentary now, scattered across museums, requiring scholarly reconstruction to read complete procedures, but readable, understandable, still bearing the precision with which they were originally composed by practitioners who knew what they were doing because they had been trained to know, because the knowledge was too important to lose, because survival in a cosmos with active divine forces required more than hope or prayer. It required procedure, and the priesthood had procedure, inherited from the Apkallu, preserved through millennia, employed wherever threatened inhabitants could afford the materials and the specialists' time. The architecture of sacred defence, built into houses and cities and temples through proper application of cosmic principle by those who possess the knowledge of how such principles functioned. This is not faith, this is operation. And it establishes a pattern we will see repeated across the ritual literature. Mesopotamian priests did not only worship divine forces, they also possessed systematic procedures for defending against them, for creating structures that would resist even divine intrusion, for operating according to cosmic principles that predated divine authority and would function independent of divine approval. The texts say this explicitly, and we must take them seriously if we want to understand what the priesthood believed it was doing. Not symbolic comfort, not theatrical performance, but cosmic defence, operational, systematic, based on knowledge that came from before the flood and remained functional because the principles it employed were structural, fundamental, true regardless of whether gods or demons or humans recognized that truth. The Beat It Rimke procedure created defended space, and defended space gave inhabitants room to operate, room to practice their own procedures, room to employ their own knowledge without immediate vulnerability to forces that might prefer them, ignorant, dependent, unable to resist. The defence was never absolute, but it was real as the figurines archaeologists still excavate from Bronze Age foundations, as real as the tablets that describe procedures with engineering precision, as real as a priesthood that spent years learning how to construct what their civilization called sacred architecture, but what functioned in practice as systematic cosmic defense against any force, divine included, that approached with hostile intent. When words became weapons, the series is called Urpu, burning. 9 tablets comprising one of Mesopotamia's major ritual compositions. Copies exist from multiple sites: Nineveh, Assur, Babylon, Sultan Tepe. The tablets describe purification procedures targeting divine curses specifically, not demonic possession, not witchcraft performed by human enemies, divine curses, afflictions that originated from the gods themselves, imposed as punishment for offence given, for taboo violated, for cosmic boundary crossed. The assumption underlying Urpu is striking. It assumes that divine curses, once imposed, could be removed through mortal procedure. Not easily. The rituals are elaborate, requiring multiple days, extensive materials, precise execution, but possible. The text described the steps. The practitioner, the Ipu, the exorcist specialist, performs purification through fire, through water, through incantations that name the curse and command its departure. The authority claimed is procedural, not based on higher divine intervention. The priest is not asking a benevolent god to override a malevolent god's curse. The priest is employing procedure that will dissolve the curse according to cosmic principles of purification. Tablet K150 in the British Museum preserves portion of Urpu II. The clay is brownish grey, typical of Ninevite tablets from Ashurbanipal's library. The script is Neo-Assyrian, 7th century BC, but the text includes Sumerian passages, archaic terminology, layers of linguistic time compressed into a single ritual procedure. The incantations address forces in the second person. Not may this curse depart, but you, curse, depart through this fire according to the power of Ea, Enki's Akkadian name, the god who possessed the me, who taught the Apkallu, who spoke to walls to circumvent divine oath. The text invokes Ea specifically as the source of the purification procedure's authority, not as petition deity but as original author of the technique. The procedure works because Ea designed it to work, because it employs cosmic principles that Ea understands and has systematized into transmissible knowledge. This is procedural authority. The priest operates as Ea's authorized agent, employing techniques Ea developed, speaking words Ea formulated, performing actions that derive their power from Ea's original instruction. The curse must yield not because Ea is personally intervening in each performance of Urpu, but because the procedure itself is part of cosmic structure that Ea administers. To resist properly executed Urpu would be to violate principles that Ea established as fundamental to how purification functions. The texts describe the materials required: cedar wood, tamarisk, specific combinations of flour and oil, water from specific sources. The materials are not arbitrary. Each has cosmic associations. Cedar is pure, incorruptible. Tamarisk grows near water, connects earth and fluid realms. The combinations create material matrices that align with cosmic purification principles. Burn them while speaking proper words, and the curse finds itself in an environment hostile to its continuation. The material and verbal components work together to create conditions where the curse cannot persist, because cosmic structure favours its dissolution. This is not wishful thinking. This is systems analysis applied to cosmic operation. The Mesopotamians understood curses as having structure. They attached to individuals through specific mechanisms. They persisted through specific channels, interfere with those mechanisms and channels through proper procedure, and the curse loses structural integrity. It cannot maintain itself against procedural assault that employs cosmic purification principles correctly. Academic scholarship interprets Urpu psychologically. The elaborate ritual gave cursed individuals psychological relief. The fire and water and incantations created communal event that marked transition from cursed to purified state. The effects were social and psychological, not cosmic. The priests performed theatre, not procedure. But the tablets do not describe theatre, they describe technique. Urpu V and Vi, which focus on the actual burning procedures, read like engineering specifications. Ignite the materials in this sequence. Speak these words at these moments. Pour water at these points. The timing matters, the sequence matters, the pronunciation matters. Because the procedure is operating on cosmic structure, and cosmic structure responds to precision, not to enthusiasm or faith or emotional intensity. Consider what this implies about how Mesopotamian priests understood divine curses. They understood them as structured phenomena, patterns imposed on cosmic fabric that would persist according to their nature unless properly disrupted. The gods could impose such patterns. They possessed the authority and the power. But once imposed, the curse operated according to principle, not according to continuing divine will. It was like setting a mechanism in motion. The mechanism would continue operating according to its design unless something interfered with its operation. Urpu was systematic interference, procedure designed to disrupt curse structure through proper application of counter principles, purification against corruption, fire against attachment, water against pollution. Each material component targeted specific aspects of how curses function. Each incantation named specific forces and commanded their departure through invocation of cosmic principles they could not violate without violating structure itself. The priest performing Urpu was not begging divine mercy. He was operating machinery. Cosmic machinery, granted, but machinery nonetheless. Understanding how it worked required training. Executing procedures required precision. But the effects were reproducible if procedure was properly followed. The curse would dissolve because cosmic structure favoured dissolution under proper conditions. Conditions the Ipu could create through material preparation and verbal formulae inherited from lineages extending back to Ear's original instruction. This challenges fundamental assumptions about prayer and ritual in ancient religion. We assume ancient peoples prayed because they felt powerless, because they could only beg for divine favour. But Urpu texts do not read like begging. They read like commands, imperatives directed at cosmic forces. You, curse, depart. You, pollution, be dissolved. You, divine anger, expend yourself in this fire and leave this person purified. The language is technical, the structure is procedural, and the authority claimed is neither personal charisma nor direct divine intervention, but proper execution of technique that derives its power from cosmic principles that pre-exist any particular instance of their application. Tablet K 2611 in the British Museum preserves fragments of Urpu procedures for lifting divine anger specifically. The text differentiates between anger from known causes, taboo violation, ritual error, offence to divine prerogative, and anger from unknown causes. The procedures differ. Known causes require confession, acknowledgement, specific address to the offended deity. Unknown causes require comprehensive purification that addresses all possible sources simultaneously, because the practitioner cannot target specific relationship if he does not know which god is angry or why. But in both cases, the procedure is designed to remove the anger, not to ask the god to remove it through proper technique, regardless of whether the god decides to relent. The fire burns, the water flows. The incantations invoke cosmic principles of purification. The divine anger, encountering environments structured to dissolve it, cannot maintain its integrity. It dissipates. The curse lifts. the affliction ends. This is operational logic, and it appears throughout Urpu with remarkable consistency. The texts were composed over centuries by different scribes in different cities, but the underlying framework remains stable. Curses operate according to structure. Structure can be modified through procedure. Properly trained practitioners can execute procedures that will produce measurable effects, including the dissolution of divine curses. Now consider the implications for divine authority. If mortal procedure can remove what divine will imposed, then divine will is not absolute. It is powerful. It is real, but it is not infinite in scope. It operates within cosmic structure that includes principles of purification, principles that even divine curses cannot violate without losing their own structural integrity. This is not rebellion against divine authority. This is operation within the same system that gives divine authority its scope. The gods can curse. The priests can purify. Both operate according to cosmic principles. Neither can violate those principles without consequences. The system is lawful, and law, properly understood, allows for countermeasures, for procedural responses, for operation that achieves effects even against the will of powerful actors within the system. The priesthood understood this. Urpu exists because they understood it. The procedures were developed, tested, refined, preserved across centuries, specifically because they worked within the Mesopotamian framework, because divine curses were real problems requiring real solutions, because prayer alone was insufficient when what was needed was procedural dissolution of structured cosmic patterns that gods had imposed. This is sophisticated religious technology, not technology in the modern sense of machines and electronics, but technology in the fundamental sense, systematic application of knowledge to achieve specific effects through reproducible procedures. The knowledge came from E. The procedures came from Apkallu instruction. The training came from lineages of specialists who learned from previous specialists. And the effects within Mesopotamian understanding were measurable, concrete, operational. A family under divine curse employed Urpu. The curse lifted. The affliction ended. Success was observable within their framework. An observable success across generations of practice validated the procedures, ensured their preservation, motivated continued refinement by specialists who understood they were working with functional knowledge, not symbolic comfort. The Urpu tablets exist because the procedures they preserve were important enough to write down, important enough to copy across centuries, important enough to transmit from one collapsing kingdom to the next. The British Museum holds fragments. The Iraq Museum holds fragments. Universities from Yale to Berlin hold fragments. Collectively, they reconstruct a ritual literature that spans 9 tablets describing systematic procedures for dissolving divine curses through proper application of cosmic purification principles. This is not minor practice. This is central religious technology of Mesopotamian civilization, and it operates on logic that modern interpretation struggles to accommodate, that divine authority, while real and powerful, was also constrained by cosmic structure, that curses, once imposed, operated according to principle rather than continuing will, that mortal specialists, properly trained in procedures derived from divine instruction, could modify cosmic structure to achieve effects including the removal of what gods had decreed. The words became weapons not through inherent power, but through proper alignment with cosmic principle. An incantation spoken incorrectly accomplished nothing, but spoken correctly at the proper moment with proper materials, in proper sequence, the same incantation commanded forces, even divine forces, to yield because the command derived its authority from structure that all forces, divine included, could not violate without compromising their own operation. This is the deepest claim of Urpu, that cosmic structure is lawful, that law includes principles of purification, that purification, properly executed, will dissolve corruption regardless of corruption's origin, that even divine curses, powerful as they are, remain subject to cosmic law, and that properly trained specialists can employ cosmic law procedurally to achieve effects that divine will alone had not authorized. The burning. Urpu. Fire as purification agent, not symbolic fire. Actual combustion transforming materials into ash and smoke, heat rising, substances consumed. The physical fire parallels cosmic fire. The material transformation mirrors cosmic transformation. And the curse, caught between properly executed procedure and cosmic principles that favour purification, finds its structure dissolved, its attachment broken, its power exhausted against technique that employs the same cosmic authority that allowed the curse to function in the first place. This is engineering. Cosmic engineering, but engineering nonetheless. And the Urpu tablets preserve the technical literature of that engineering for any specialist trained to read them, trained to execute their procedures, trained to operate within cosmic structure with understanding sufficient to achieve effects through knowledge rather than through begging for. Mercy from powers that might not grant it. The words became weapons, not through magic, through procedure, through systematic application of cosmic principles that predated divine authority and constrained its operation, through knowledge inherited from Ea, who possessed the Me, and taught the Apkallu, who transmitted to the priesthood, who preserved in tablets now scattered across museums around the world. Tablets that still bear, in cuneiform impressed into clay, the technical literature of how to dissolve what gods imposed, how to purify what divine anger corrupted, how to operate within cosmic structure with precision sufficient to achieve effects that prayer alone could never accomplish. Urpu remains. The procedures remain, and in their preservation is testament to a religious culture that understood authority, even divine authority, as operating within systems that skilled practitioners could navigate, could employ, could turn to purposes that those in authority had not necessarily intended to permit. The fire burns, the curse dissolves, the afflicted are purified, not because God showed mercy, because cosmic structure, properly engaged through procedural knowledge, favours purification over corruption when the procedure is executed correctly by those who possess the knowledge of how such procedures function. This is what the priesthood knew. This is what Urpu preserves. This is what we must understand if we are to take Mesopotamian religious practice seriously on its own terms, rather than reducing it to primitive superstition or symbolic theatre. They were operating, they possessed knowledge, and that knowledge, according to tablets now catalogued in museum vaults, included systematic procedures for undoing what even gods had done, for dissolving curses through fire, for transforming words into weapons through proper alignment with cosmic principles that no authority, however divine, could violate without compromising the very structure that made authority operational. The tablets remain, the knowledge remains, and with it remains the uncomfortable question, what else did they know? What other procedures did they preserve? What other operations did their religious technology enable when divine forces became hostile and prayer was insufficient, and what was needed was systematic procedural resistance based on knowledge that came from the gods themselves and could not be fully revoked once properly transmitted? We continue reading what they wrote, and what they wrote describes capabilities that challenge every comfortable assumption about powerless ancient humans begging mercy from capricious gods. The relationship was more complex, more technical, more operational, and the evidence sits in fragments in museum vaults, waiting for readers willing to take the priests at their word when they said they possess procedures for dissolving divine curses, for burning away what gods imposed, for operating within cosmic structure with precision that made divine will negotiable rather than absolute. Urpu, burning, the procedure and the name, both preserved, both functional within their framework, both testament to knowledge that the Mesopotamian priesthood guarded as their most essential inheritance, knowledge of how to purify, how to resist, how to operate within divine systems with understanding sufficient to achieve effects through procedure rather than through submission. This is what words became, weapons against what even gods decreed, and the tablets preserve the arsenal. The Namburbi paradox. The logic appears across hundreds of tablets excavated from Mesopotamian sites: Nineveh, Assur, Kalhu, Babylon. The tablets record a ritual category that scholars call Namburbi, prophylactic procedures designed to avert evil portended by omens before that evil manifests in physical reality. The name itself derives from Sumerian Namburbi, its loosening or its release. The release of fate, the undoing of what has been observed but not yet occurred. Consider what this assumes. The Mesopotamians practiced divination extensively. They read omens in liver patterns of sacrificed animals, in oil dropped on water, in the flights of birds, in the positions of stars, in dreams, in accidents and coincidences, and any observable phenomenon that might carry cosmic significance. Entire libraries of omen texts catalogued correlations. If the liver shows this configuration, then the king will face revolt. If the oil spreads in this pattern, then disease will strike the household. If Mars appears in this constellation, then the harvest will fail. These were not superstitions casually believed. They were systematic knowledge compiled over centuries of observation, copied into reference works called if-then texts because of their structure. If this sign appears, then this consequence follows. The pattern held. The correlations had been tested. The omens were reliable within the Mesopotamian framework, which created a problem. If divination reveals coming disaster, and if divine will determines what divination reveals, then the disaster is fated, decreed, inevitable. The gods have decided. The omen merely makes visible what has already been determined in divine council. Human response should be acceptance, preparation, submission to what cannot be changed. But the Namburbi texts operate on different logic entirely. They assume that omens reveal probable futures, not fixed fates. They assume that proper procedure, executed between observation of the omen and manifestation of its consequence, can intercept the causal chain, can redirect what was observed, can transform probable disaster into averted disaster through procedural intervention that employs cosmic principles to modify what divination had revealed as coming. This is the paradox. If omens reveal divine will, then resisting omens means resisting divine will. But the Namburbi procedures were not fringe practice. They were mainstream religious technology employed by kings, by temples, by any household that could afford the specialist services when inauspicious omens appeared. The procedures were collected, systematized, preserved in extensive ritual literature because they were understood to work. Tablet collections from Ashurbanipal's library include dozens of Namburbi procedures. Each targets a specific omen category: inauspicious liver configurations, malevolent dream content, eclipse observations that portend royal disaster. The procedures share common structure, identify the omen, name its predicted consequence, perform material actions while speaking incantations that invoke cosmic principles of release and transformation, redirect the evil to substitute targets, or dissolve it entirely before it can manifest. The logic is procedural. The omen reveals pattern. Pattern proceeds toward manifestation according to cosmic structure. But cosmic structure includes principles of deflection, substitution, transformation. Engage those principles properly before manifestation occurs, and the pattern can be altered. The evil predicted will not occur, not because the gods changed their minds, but because procedural intervention modified the causal structure that would have produced the evil outcome. This is sophisticated cosmology. It assumes a cosmos that operates according to principle rather than arbitrary divine whim. The gods can influence cosmic patterns. They possess the authority and the power. But once a pattern is set in motion, its operation follows principle. And principle can be engaged by anyone who understands how it works, who possesses the proper procedures, who executes those procedures correctly at the right moment in the causal sequence. The Namburbi texts make this explicit. They do not ask gods to change what has been decreed. They invoke Ea, they invoke Marduk, they invoke protective forces, but the invocation is not petition, it is authorization. Through the authority of Ea, who possesses the me of cosmic structure, through proper procedure taught by the Apkallu, this evil is hereby released, this fate is hereby loosened, this consequence is hereby redirected. The language is declarative. The priest announces what the procedure accomplishes. He does not beg, he operates. And the operation derives its authority from Ea's original instruction, from the Apkallu's transmission, from knowledge that has been tested across centuries of practice and found functional. But how can this work if the gods decreed the fate revealed by omens? Academic scholarship struggles with this question. The usual answer is that Mesopotamians held inconsistent beliefs. They believed in both divine omnipotence and magical manipulation of fate. The contradiction didn't bother them because they weren't systematic thinkers. They employed whatever practice offered psychological comfort regardless of logical coherence. This interpretation is condescending and, more importantly, contradicted by the texts themselves. The texts are sophisticated. They differentiate between types of omens. They specify which can be averted through Namburbi and which cannot. They acknowledge that some fates, once decreed, are fixed. But they maintain that many, perhaps most, omens reveal probable patterns that remain subject to modification through proper procedure executed at proper time. The framework is internally consistent. It assumes a cosmos where authority is distributed, where the gods possess great power but not infinite control, where cosmic operation follows principle that even gods cannot arbitrarily override, where fate is complex, some things fixed, others contingent, still others modifiable through knowledge and procedure. Within this framework, Namburbi makes sense. It targets the contingent and the modifiable. It employs cosmic principles of release and deflection that exist as part of fundamental structure. It operates through procedures authorized by E, who designed cosmic structure and therefore knows its flexibility, its technicalities, its methods of modification. The procedures involve substitution frequently. A figurine is created representing the threatened person. The Namburbi ritual transfers the evil from person to figurine. The figurine is destroyed, buried, burned, thrown in river. The evil, having been successfully attached to substitute target, departs with that target. The original person remains protected because the causal chain was redirected through procedure that cosmic structure permits. This is not random magic. This is systematic procedure based on understanding that cosmic patterns can attach to symbolic representatives. That attachment can be manipulated through proper technique. That destruction of the representative can discharge the pattern before it affects its original target. The principle is sophisticated, the execution requires training, but the framework is coherent within Mesopotamian cosmology. Other Namburbi procedures employ purification. The threatened person undergoes ritual washing, fumigation, verbal cleansing. The procedure removes attachment points where the evil might manifest. Without attachment points, the pattern cannot complete its manifestation. It dissipates, seeking target but finding no purchase, because proper purification has rendered the person immune to that specific pattern's operation. Again, this is systematic thinking. Evil requires attachment. Remove attachment capacity, and evil cannot manifest regardless of whether it was divinely decreed. The decree remains theoretically valid, but it cannot execute because the target has been modified through procedure to prevent execution. This is the Namburbi's logic, not to oppose divine will directly, but to modify conditions so that divine will cannot execute its intended effect. Academic interpretation calls this magical thinking. but it's more accurate to call it systems thinking applied to cosmic operation. The Mesopotamians understood their universe as complex, multi-layered, operating according to principles that created opportunities for intervention by those who understood how the system worked. Divination revealed patterns. Namburbi modified patterns. Both were legitimate operations within cosmic structure. Neither contradicted the other, because both operated according to principle rather than arbitrary power. The evidence for Namburbi's perceived effectiveness is the extent of its preservation. If the procedures routinely failed, they would have been abandoned. But Namburbi texts proliferate across centuries. They appear in multiple copies. They show refinement over time, procedures being adjusted, improved, specified with greater precision. This is the pattern of functional technology being developed through iterative practice, not the pattern of wishful thinking being preserved despite obvious failure. The tablets record cases. A king observes inauspicious eclipse. Court diviners predict disaster. Namburbi ritual is performed. The predicted disaster does not occur. The pattern is recorded as validation of procedure. Perhaps the disaster would not have occurred anyway. Academic skepticism raises this possibility. But within the Mesopotamian framework, the causal relationship was clear. Omen predicted evil. Procedure was executed. Evil did not manifest. Therefore, procedure was effective. Thousands of such cases across centuries of practice created confidence in Namburbi's functionality. The procedures became standard response to inauspicious divination. Not because Mesopotamians were credulous, but because the procedures worked within their understanding of cosmic operation. They produced measurable results. They prevented disasters that divination had predicted. The causal mechanism, procedural modification of cosmic patterns, was coherent within their cosmology and validated through repeated application. This challenges modern assumptions about fate and free will, about divine determination and human agency. We tend to think in binary terms: either fate is fixed or it's not, either gods control everything or they don't, either humans are powerless or they're autonomous. The Mesopotamian framework is more nuanced. Fate is complex. Some things are fixed, some are contingent. Divine power is real, but operates within structure. Human agency is limited, but can be amplified through knowledge and procedure. Namburbi exists in the space between divine authority and cosmic structure. It assumes that even when gods decree outcomes, if those outcomes depend on patterns that follow principle, then principle can be engaged to modify patterns before they complete. The gods decreed, yes, but decree operates through cosmic structure, and structure permits intervention by those who understand how it works. This is not rebellion. This is not defiance of divine authority. This is operation within the system according to rules the system itself permits. Namburbi practitioners were not opposing the gods. They were employing knowledge that ultimately derived from gods, from Ea specifically, from the Apkallu he sent. They were using divine instruction to modify what divine counsel had decreed, not through superior power, but through superior understanding of how cosmic structure actually functions. The paradox dissolves when understood this way. Namburbi does not contradict divine authority. It operates within cosmic structure that divine authority itself must respect. The gods can decree. But decree must manifest through principle, and principle permits deflection, substitution, transformation, when proper procedures are executed at proper times by properly trained practitioners. The tablets preserve this knowledge not as contradiction, but as complementary operation. Divination reveals. Namburbi modifies. Both are necessary. Both are legitimate. Both operate according to cosmic principles that the gods designed, but cannot arbitrarily override without compromising the very structure that makes their authority functional. This is sophisticated religious technology, and its preservation across millennia suggests it was not wishful thinking, but functional practice within a cosmology that we have difficulty understanding because we lack the framework that made it coherent. The Mesopotamians did not believe in both divine omnipotence and magical manipulation. They believed in structured cosmos, where authority operated according to principle, where knowledge allowed for intervention, where fate was complex enough to include both fixed elements and modifiable patterns. The Namburbi texts exist because they were needed, because inauspicious omens appeared regularly, because disaster was always possible, because divine will was not always benevolent, and because the priesthood possessed procedures inherited from divine instruction via the Apkallu that could modify what divination revealed before that revelation became physical reality. Release, loosening, Namburbi. The word itself encodes the function, not destruction of fate, not opposition to divine will, but release of pattern, loosening of attachment, deflection of evil before manifestation completes. Technical terminology for technical procedure executed by specialists who understood cosmic structure well enough to operate within it effectively. The paradox was never real. It only appears paradoxical when we impose our binary categories onto their nuanced cosmology. Within their framework, Namburbi makes perfect sense. Within their framework, it was necessary protective technology that complemented divination rather than contradicting it. Within their framework, it worked. And it worked because cosmic structure permitted it, because knowledge of cosmic structure had been transmitted from divine source to mortal practitioners, because the priesthood preserved that knowledge and trained specialists in its application, because the Mesopotamians understood, perhaps better than we do, that authority operates through system, and system creates opportunities for those who understand its operation. The Namburbi tablets remain. Museum collections hold dozens. More are excavated regularly from sites across Iraq. The procedures they preserve are complex, detailed, systematic. The language is technical. The logic is coherent within Mesopotamian cosmology, and the fact of their preservation across centuries is evidence that they worked, that within the framework that shaped Mesopotamian understanding of divine power and cosmic structure, these procedures accomplished what they claimed: the deflection of evil, the release of fate, the modification of what divination had revealed through operation that employed cosmic principles known to specialists trained in their application. This is what the priesthood knew, that fate could be read, and that what could be read could sometimes, through proper procedure, be modified. Not always, not easily, but possible, because cosmic structure allowed it, because divine instruction had transmitted the knowledge, because the Apkallu taught, and the priesthood remembered, and the procedures remained functional across millennia of continuous practice. The paradox dissolves. What remains is operation, systematic, procedural operation within cosmic structure by practitioners who possess knowledge inherited from divine source and employed that knowledge to achieve effects that included, when properly executed at proper time, the release of fate that divination had revealed as coming. Namburbi, its loosening, its release. The technical terminology for protective procedure that assumed fate was complex enough to include modification. That assumed cosmic structure was lawful enough to permit intervention. That assumed knowledge, properly applied, created agency even in face of divine decree. This is what the tablets preserve. And this is what we must understand if we are to grasp what Mesopotamian religious practice actually involved. Not passive submission, not helpless prayer, but active operation within cosmic structure by specialists who possess knowledge and employed procedures that derived their authority from the same divine source that authorized divination itself. Two sides of the same coin. Divination reveals, Namburbi modifies. Both operate according to cosmic principle. Both are necessary for survival in cosmos where divine forces are real, powerful, and not automatically benevolent. Both were preserved because both worked within the framework that shaped Mesopotamian understanding of how their universe actually functioned. The tablets remain in museum vaults. The procedures remain readable, and the question they pose remains uncomfortable. What else becomes possible when cosmic structure is understood well enough to permit modification, when fate is complex enough to include both fixed and contingent elements, when knowledge allows intervention between divine decree and physical manifestation? The Namburbi texts answer, much becomes possible, not unlimited, not easy, but far more than we assume when we imagine ancient peoples as helpless before divine power. They possessed procedures. They employed knowledge. They operated within cosmic structure with skill sufficient to modify probable futures before those futures became present reality. This is their inheritance, preserved in clay, written in cuneiform, transmitted across centuries because it was too valuable to lose. Knowledge of how to read fate, and when necessary, how to release it before it could manifest as disaster. The paradox was never real. The operation was always systematic, and the tablets that preserve it remain testament to religious culture that understood agency as procedural, authority as structured, and knowledge as sufficient to create intervention, even when gods had decreed outcomes that humans preferred to avoid. Enki's secret distribution. The pattern appears consistently across Mesopotamian ritual literature. The most powerful protective procedures, the ones that directly address divine forces, that claim to bind or deflect or redirect what gods decree, these procedures are explicitly attributed to Enki, not to human innovation, not to institutional development over time, to Enki, the god of wisdom, the god of deep waters, the god who possessed the me and understood cosmic structure from the inside because he administered it. The question is why? Why would Enki teach mortals procedures for resisting divine will? Why would a god systematically distribute knowledge that would allow humans to deflect what gods decreed, to purify what gods cursed, to avert what gods portended? The mythology offers an answer, but it's an answer that creates discomfort with comfortable assumptions about divine unity and divine purpose. Enki consistently appears in Mesopotamian texts as the god who sides with humanity against divine consensus that favours destruction or limitation. The flood narrative makes this explicit. The Anunnaki Council decided to destroy humanity. Enki was bound by oath not to warn them. But Enki found technicality, speaking to a wall, transmitting information without technically violating his oath. He ensured human survival when divine majority had decreed extinction. This is not isolated incident, it's pattern. Enki repeatedly distributes knowledge, power, capability to humans despite resistance from other gods. He gives the me to humanity through various means, sometimes directly, sometimes through the Apkallu, sometimes through cunning transfer, like when Inanna stole them while he was drunk. But the pattern holds. Enki is the source. Knowledge flows from him to mortals, and that knowledge includes protective procedure, defensive ritual, techniques that allow humans to operate within divine systems with agency beyond what other gods intended to permit. The ritual texts acknowledge this explicitly. The Makal series invokes Enki by name. The Urpu procedures attribute their authority to Ii, Enki's Akkadian name. The Udug-Hul demon-binding incantations claim to employ Enki's power. The Namburbi deflection rituals operate according to principles Enki established. Again and again, the texts trace authorization backward to the same source, the god who understood cosmic structure and taught humans how to engage that structure procedurally. Academic scholarship notes this pattern but interprets it through the lens of Enki's portfolio. He was god of wisdom and magic, so naturally magical rituals would claim his authority. This is functional attribution, not theological statement. The priests needed authorization for their procedures, so they attributed them to appropriate deity. The attribution is rhetorical strategy, not claim about actual transmission. But this interpretation ignores the narrative consistency. Enki doesn't just authorize magic in general, he specifically authorizes protective magic, defensive procedure, knowledge that allows humans to resist what other divine forces impose. The selection is not arbitrary, it's purposeful, and it aligns with Enki's consistent characterization across Mesopotamian mythology as the god who ensures human capability even against divine consensus that would prefer human limitation. The text suggests a cosmological conflict, not dualism. Enki is not opposed to the divine order, but tension within the Anunnaki Council itself. Different gods had different priorities. Enlil, senior god, chief of divine assembly, favoured order, hierarchy, human submission to divine authority. When humans became too numerous, too noisy, too problematic, Enlil decreed the flood. Other gods agreed. Divine consensus supported destruction, but Enki disagreed. And Enki's disagreement was not merely emotional preference. It was rooted in his understanding of cosmic function. Humanity served purpose in Enki's architecture of reality. They were necessary operators of civilization, necessary maintainers of temples, necessary performers of rituals that kept cosmic systems running. To destroy them entirely would be to disrupt cosmic operation itself. So Enki ensured their survival despite divine consensus. And after the flood, when humanity was rebuilding, Enki ensured they would not be vulnerable to future divine caprice. The Apkallu was sent. Knowledge was transmitted. Procedures were taught. Not just how to build temples and cities, but how to defend them, how to protect against divine anger, how to operate within cosmic systems with sufficient understanding to resist when necessary, how to survive in a universe where gods were real, powerful, and not unified in their intentions toward humanity. This is sophisticated theology. It acknowledges divine power while denying divine unity of purpose. It assumes that cosmic politics are complex, that gods have different priorities, that human survival requires alignment with factions within divine realm that favour human capability over human submission. Enki was that faction's representative, and his distribution of knowledge to humanity was his strategic move in ongoing cosmic politics. The ritual texts preserve the results. Procedures attributed to Enki. Knowledge claimed to come from his instruction. Techniques that employ cosmic structure he administers, all designed to give humans leverage. Not to make them divine equals, that was never possible, but to make them capable operators, to give them defensive procedures, to ensure they would not be helpless before divine forces that might turn hostile. This is why the exorcistic literature invokes Enki so consistently. The Udug Hall series, Evil Demons, describes procedures for expelling malevolent forces. The series is extensive, 16 tablets in its canonical form with additional supplementary procedures. The forces described as evil demons include obvious demonic beings like Lilitu and Rabisu, but the texts also include forces that blur into divine categories, messengers of gods, executors of divine will, beings sent by the Anunnaki to punish, to afflict, to enforce divine decree, and the Udul Hall procedures treat them all the same. The method for expelling a demon and the method for expelling a divine messenger employ identical ritual logic. Both are bound through incantation. Both are commanded to depart through invocation of Enki's authority. Both are forced to yield because cosmic structure, which Enki administers, permits their expulsion when proper procedure is executed. This is startling when stated plainly. The ritual literature assumes that forces sent by gods to execute divine will can be bound and expelled through procedures that employ Enki's authority. Not easily, these are elaborate rituals requiring specialist knowledge and precise execution, but possible, because Enki designed cosmic structure to include such possibilities, because Enki taught the procedures, because Enki's faction within divine politics favoured human capability over human helplessness. The mainstream interpretation struggles with this. Obviously, the priests couldn't actually expel divine messengers. Obviously, the rituals were psychological comfort against forces they couldn't control. Obviously the attribution to Enki was rhetorical flourish, not claim about actual divine support for human resistance against divine will. But the texts do not read as rhetorical flourish. They read as technical procedure claiming genuine divine authorization. And the authorization is specific. Enki, not the Anunnaki collectively, not Enlil, the senior authority. Enki the wise, Enki the trickster, Enki who found technicalities and taught humans how systems worked and ensured that knowledge would survive even when other gods preferred human ignorance. The pattern extends beyond exorcism. The protective amulet tradition invokes Enki, small clay or stone objects inscribed with incantations, worn or buried to provide ongoing defense. The incantations are miniature versions of longer rituals. They invoke Enki's name. They claim his protection. They assert that the wearer/carrier is under Enki's authority and therefore immune to affliction from forces that Enki's cosmic structure does not authorize to harm them. This is procedural protection. The amulet works within Mesopotamian framework because it properly invokes legitimate authority within cosmic structure. Enki possesses that authority. He has distributed it to humans through taught procedures. The amulet is material instantiation of that distribution. Wear it properly while maintaining proper relationship with Enki through ritual obligation, and you gain defense against forces that cosmic structure, as Enki administers it, permits you to resist. Thousands of such amulets have been excavated. They span centuries of Mesopotamian civilization. They appear across social classes, wealthy burials and poor burials alike. The practice was mainstream, not fringe, and it was based on understanding that Enki had distributed defensive capability to humans, had taught them how to create and employ protective devices, had authorized them to resist certain classes of affliction through proper procedure. Why would Enki do this? The mythology suggests he understood that cosmic function required capable human operators. That civilization served divine purposes, maintaining temples, performing rituals, administering cosmic systems at material level, that helpless humans could not perform these functions effectively, that capable humans, armed with protective procedures and defensive knowledge, could maintain civilization even when faced with divine forces that might otherwise destroy them. This is pragmatic theology. Enki supported humanity not from benevolence alone, but from understanding that cosmic function required human capability. His distribution of knowledge was strategic. His teaching of protective procedures was insurance against other divine forces whose priorities might threaten the human civilization that Enki needed to maintain cosmic order at material level. The texts support this reading. Enki is wise, cunning, practical. He operates through technicality, through procedure, through systematic knowledge. He is not sentimentally attached to humanity. He is practically invested in their capability because their capability serves his broader purposes in cosmic administration. So, he teaches. He distributes knowledge. He ensures humans possess defensive procedures. Not unlimited procedures, humans remain limited, but sufficient procedures. Enough to survive, enough to operate, enough to maintain civilization despite divine forces that would prefer them simplified, reduced, or eliminated. This is the secret distribution. Secret not because Enki hid it, but because it reveals divine politics that uncomfortable narrative of unified divine authority would prefer to obscure. The gods were not unified. They had different priorities. Some, represented by Enlil, favoured human limitation. Others, represented by Enki, favoured human capability. The tension was ongoing, and Enki's secret distribution of protective knowledge to humanity through the Apkallu was his move in that ongoing tension. The priesthood inherited this knowledge. They preserved it across generations. They trained specialists in its application. They understood themselves as Enki's authorized agents, employing procedures he designed, operating within cosmic structure he administered, defending humanity against forces that included divine messengers executing divine will that Enki's faction within the Anunnaki did not approve. This is radical theology. It challenges monotheistic assumptions we unconsciously import into ancient polytheism. We assume the gods worked together, that divine will was unified, that humans related to divinity as unified category. But Mesopotamian texts suggest something more complex: divided divine politics, different factions with different priorities, human civilization caught between competing divine agendas, and human priests aligning with one faction, Enki's faction, that favoured human capability and distributed knowledge necessary for human survival. The ritual texts preserve evidence of this alignment. Enki is invoked, his authority is claimed, his procedures are employed. And those procedures include binding divine messengers, deflecting divine curses, resisting divine will when that will originates from factions hostile to human capability, not rebellion against divinity itself, strategic alignment with one divine faction against another, operation within cosmic politics rather than helpless submission to undifferentiated divine power. This is what the priesthood knew. This is what Enki's secret distribution meant in practice. Knowledge that gods were not unified, knowledge that some divine forces favoured human capability, knowledge that proper alignment with proper divine faction, specifically with Enki, who possessed the me and administered cosmic structure, gave humans leverage, gave them procedures, gave them defensive capability that other gods might not have preferred them to possess. The texts preserve this knowledge in technical procedures attributed to Enki, in protective rituals claiming his authority, in exorcistic literature employing his power to bind forces sent by other gods. The distribution was systematic, the knowledge was functional, and the result was priesthood that understood itself not as helpless mediators between omnipotent gods and powerless humans, but as strategic operators within cosmic politics aligned with divine faction that had armed them with knowledge sufficient to survive. Enki's secret distribution was not secret because hidden. It was secret because revealing the complexity, the divine politics, the tension within the Anunnaki, the strategic distribution of knowledge to humans for purposes that other gods opposed. This complexity challenged comfortable narratives of divine unity and divine benevolence that later monotheistic traditions would prefer to maintain. But the texts remain, the procedures remain, and in them is evidence of more sophisticated theology than we typically attribute to ancient Mesopotamia. Theology that acknowledged divine conflict, that understood cosmic politics, that aligned humanity with divine faction favourable to human capability, that distributed knowledge systematically because that knowledge was necessary for human survival in cosmos where divine forces were powerful, real, and not unified in their intentions. Enki taught, the Apkallu transmitted, the priesthood preserved, and what they preserved included procedures for resisting divine will, not all divine will, but specific instances of divine will originating from divine factions that Enki's cosmic structure permitted them to resist through proper procedure executed with proper knowledge. This is inheritance we can trace through tablets preserved across museums worldwide, procedures attributed to Enki, knowledge claimed from divine source, techniques that employ cosmic structure to achieve effects including defense against divine forces, all preserved because the knowledge was functional within Mesopotamian cosmology, all transmitted because Enki had ensured it would be transmitted, all operational because cosmic structure, as Enki administered it, permitted such operation by those who possess the knowledge. The secret distribution continues even now. Not in living practice, Mesopotamian civilization ended millennia ago, but in preserved tablets, in readable cuneiform, in procedures that still testify to the complexity of ancient theology, to the sophistication of cosmic understanding, to the reality of divine politics that shaped how humanity related to forces claiming divine authority. Enki taught resistance, not rebellion, resistance through knowledge, through procedure, through alignment with cosmic structure that even opposing divine factions could not arbitrarily override. And that teaching, preserved in ritual texts now scattered across continents, remains testament to theology that understood divine power as real but not unified, as powerful but not absolute, as operating within cosmic structure that permitted, for those with knowledge, strategic operation even, against divine forces that claimed ultimate authority. The Makal procedure. British Museum tablet K2950 contains the complete ritual manual, 8 tablets in the canonical series, and K2950 is tablet the 8th, the culmination procedure, the final night of ceremony that brings all previous preparations to conclusion. The ritual is called Makal, burning, and what burns through the night, from sunset until dawn, are figurines representing witches, sorcerers, those who manipulate cosmic forces to cause harm. But the text is more specific than generic witchcraft. The forces being burned include those who employ divine authority, who work through divine channels, who afflict their targets with what appears to be divine curse, but operates through human manipulation of cosmic procedure. The Makal addresses this directly. It does not merely protect against human enemies. It protects against cosmic assault that might employ divine mechanisms. It burns away attachments regardless of their source. It purifies the targeted person so thoroughly that even forces operating through legitimate cosmic channels find no purchase, no attachment point, no way to complete their intended effect. The procedure spans 8 tablets because it is comprehensive. It requires preparation. Materials must be gathered from specific sources. The practitioner, the Ipu specialist, must purify himself according to preliminary procedures before he can perform the main ritual. The patient must be prepared through confession, through preliminary purification, through establishment of proper mental and cosmic state. The timing must align. Makal is performed at night, in darkness, because what is being addressed operates in darkness, in hidden channels, in cosmic shadow, where malevolent manipulation thrives. Tablet the 8th describes the climactic procedure. The practitioner creates figurines, small images of clay, of dough, of materials specified in previous tablets. The figurines represent the witches, the manipulators, those who have attached cosmic harm to the patient. The images are not portraits. They are symbolic representatives, anchors for cosmic patterns that will be destroyed when the images burn. At specific hours through the night, the practitioner burns the figurines, one by one, or in groups according to the procedure's requirements. As they burn, he recites incantations, long complex verbal formulae preserved in K2950 with precise spelling, specific pronunciation markers, indications of where vocal emphasis falls. The words are not prayer, they are commands, imperatives directed at cosmic forces. You who have afflicted this person, you are hereby burned. You who have attached curse, you are hereby dissolved. You who have manipulated divine channel, you are hereby expelled. The language is direct. The practitioner speaks with authority derived from Enki, invoked by name in the text. Through the power of Ea, Lord of the Deep Master of Cosmic Structure, I command your departure. The authority claimed is not personal, it is procedural. The practitioner operates as Enki's authorized agent, employing procedures Enki designed, speaking words Enki formulated, performing actions that derive their power from cosmic structure that Enki administers. The fire is central. Physical combustion parallels cosmic combustion. As material dissolves in flame, so cosmic patterns attached to the patient are dissolved. The smoke rises, carrying away what was burned. The ash falls, no longer dangerous, reduced to inert material that can be disposed of without risk. The transformation is both material and cosmic. The procedure operates on both levels simultaneously because, in Mesopotamian understanding, material and cosmic are not separate realms but interwoven aspects of single structured reality. K2950 specifies materials for the fire. Cedar is preferred, incorruptible, pure, associated with divine realms. Tamarisk is acceptable alternative. Specific types of wood, specific combinations of kindling, specific oils to ensure sustained flame. The material specifications are not arbitrary. They create proper conditions for cosmic operation. The fire must burn correctly, not too hot, not too cool, sustained through the night without premature extinction, because the cosmic operation depends on material operation proceeding according to proper principle. The text includes incantations to be spoken at specific moments: when the first figurine enters flame, when the fire reaches maximum intensity, when dawn approaches and the final cleansing occurs. Each incantation addresses different forces. Early ones target the witch, the manipulator, the human source of cosmic manipulation. Middle ones target the cosmic patterns themselves, the curses, the attachments, the mechanisms through which harm operates. Final ones invoke comprehensive protection, sealing the patient against future assault, establishing cosmic defense that will persist after the ritual concludes. This is layered procedure. It operates on multiple levels because the problem it addresses is multi-layered. Witchcraft in Mesopotamian understanding was not merely psychological, it was cosmic manipulation. A witch could employ legitimate cosmic procedures, similar to what priests employed, but turn them toward harmful ends. A sorcerer could attach curses through knowledge of cosmic structure, through manipulation of divine channels, through procedure that was technically legitimate but ethically corrupt. Mackle addresses this by employing superior procedure, by operating through Enki's explicit authorization, by dissolving attachments at their root rather than merely deflecting symptoms, by burning away the cosmic patterns through fire that operates materially and cosmically simultaneously. The witch's procedure is undone, the curse's structure is dissolved, the patient is freed because proper execution of Mackle employs cosmic principles superior to those the witch could access. But here's where the text becomes genuinely unsettling. The incantations in K2950 do not always differentiate clearly between human witchcraft and divine curse. Some passages address those who afflict through divine name. Other passages speak of curse sent by gods, without specifying whether gods sent it directly or humans manipulated divine channels. The language blurs what modern interpretation wants to keep distinct. This suggests that Mackle operated at level where the distinction did not matter. Whether curse originated from human witch manipulating divine procedure or from divine source directly, if it operated through attachable cosmic patterns, Mackle could address it. The fire burned, the patterns dissolved. The authority derived from Enki permitted the operation regardless of the affliction's origin. This is extraordinary claim. The text is asserting that properly executed Mackle, operating through Enki's authority, employing cosmic fire properly sustained through ritual night, could dissolve even divinely sourced curses if those curses operated through structural patterns that fire could reach. Not all divine curses, the texts acknowledge limits, but a significant category of divine affliction that function through attachable patterns could be burned away like any witch's manipulation. Academic scholarship notes this ambiguity, but interprets it as theological confusion. Obviously, Mesopotamians distinguished between divine curse and human witchcraft. The blurred language in Mackle is just rhetorical excess, poetic flourishing that wasn't meant literally. The priests didn't actually believe they could burn away divine curses through nighttime fire ceremony. But K2950 is not poetic, it is technical literature. The language throughout is procedural, specific, detailed. When it says curse sent by gods in the same section as manipulation by witches, and applies identical burning procedure to both, the most straightforward reading is that the procedure was understood to work on both categories. That Makul's authority, derived from Enki, operating through properly sustained ritual fire, could dissolve cosmic patterns regardless of whether human or divine agent had established those patterns initially. This aligns with broader patterns in Mesopotamian ritual literature. The defensive procedures do not exempt divine sources. The protective architecture, created through Bitirimki, deflects divine anger explicitly. The Urpu purification addresses curses from gods through material fire. The Namburbia version rituals redirect evil portended by gods before manifestation. Again and again, the ritual literature treats divine affliction as addressable through proper procedure executed by properly trained specialists. The underlying framework is consistent. Cosmic patterns operate according to structure. Whether gods or humans establish those patterns, once established they proceed according to principle. And principle permits intervention by those who understand how cosmic structure works, who possess proper procedures, who execute those procedures with precision that Enki's authorization empowers. The Makul procedure is the most comprehensive example. 8 tablets of systematic instruction, night-long ceremony, fire sustained from sunset to dawn, figurines burned one by one, incantations spoken at proper moments, materials carefully specified, timing precisely controlled. The ritual is elaborate because what it addresses is serious. Cosmic assault, patterns of harm attached through legitimate cosmic channels by agencies that might include divine forces themselves. And the claim, uncomfortable but explicit in K2950, is that the procedure works, that properly executed Makul, performed by properly trained Ipu, operating through Enki's distributed authority, employing cosmic fire sustained according to proper principle, will dissolve the patterns, will free the patient, will burn away attachments regardless of their source. Because the procedure operates at level of cosmic structure itself, at level where authority derives not from power but from knowledge, not from might but from understanding how cosmic patterns can be engaged, modified, dissolved through proper technique. This is what British Museum tablet K2950 preserves, not mythology, not symbolic poetry, but technical manual for comprehensive cosmic defense. Procedure requiring specialist training, expensive materials, all-night execution. Procedure that claims, through Enki's explicit authorization, to dissolve harmful cosmic patterns, whether those patterns originate from human manipulation or divine curse. Procedure tested across centuries of practice and preserved in cuneiform, impressed into clay because it was too valuable to lose. The fire burns. The figurines dissolve, the curses are released, and the patient, having undergone Makul procedure properly executed, emerges at dawn freed from attachments that might have included, among other sources, divine affliction operating through cosmic channels that even gods employed, but that Enki's distributed knowledge permitted specialists to address through procedural fire. This is Enki's legacy in its most comprehensive form. Knowledge so systematic it filled 8 tablets. Procedure so effective it was preserved across millennia. Authority so legitimate it claimed ability to dissolve even divine curses when those curses operated through structural patterns that fire, properly employed through proper knowledge, could reach and reduce to ash and smoke rising into dawn sky over Mesopotamian cities where priests operated. Through the night, defending patients against cosmos itself. K2950 remains. Readable. Complete. Technical manual for procedure that challenges every comfortable assumption about powerless ancient humans before omnipotent gods. The text claims authority, claims effectiveness, claims ability to burn away even divine affliction through proper execution of ritual fire procedure authorized by God, who understood cosmic structure from inside and taught humans how to engage that structure procedurally rather than through helpless supplication. The tablet is catalogued, the procedure is preserved, and the question it poses remains: what did they know? What could they actually accomplish? And how does their preserved ritual literature challenge our assumptions about the relationship between divine power and human knowledge in ancient cosmology that took both seriously as operational forces within structured universe? Mackle answers: they knew how to burn, how to dissolve, how to free patients from cosmic patterns attached by forces that included divine channels. They possessed the knowledge, they executed the procedure, and they preserved it in tablets that remain readable, that testify to religious practice more sophisticated than we acknowledge when we dismiss ancient ritual as primitive theatre or psychological comfort. They were burning curses through the night, with fire that operated materially and cosmically, with authority derived from divine source that favoured human capability, with procedures tested and refined and preserved because within their framework they worked. The fire burns, the patterns dissolve, and the knowledge that made it possible sits in museum vault, impressed in clay, waiting for readers willing to take technical literature seriously rather than reducing it to mythology that couldn't possibly have meant what it explicitly claims. The knowledge that remains. The tablets exist, scattered across museums from London to Philadelphia to Baghdad. Mackle, Urpu, Bitirimki, Udughul, Namburbi procedures, protective incantations, exorcistic formulae. Thousands of clay fragments preserving systematic knowledge that Mesopotamian priests treated as operational, not symbolic. Technical literature for engaging cosmic forces through procedure rather than prayer alone. The pattern is consistent. These procedures do not merely petition divine favour. They claim authority derived from Enki, transmitted through the Apkallu, preserved by specialists trained in cosmic structures operation. They employ materials specified with engineering precision. They require timing controlled to specific hours. They involve verbal formulae where pronunciation and sequence determine effectiveness. This is not theatre. This is systematic practice based on understanding that cosmos operates according to principle, that principle can be engaged by those with knowledge, that proper procedure produces measurable effects. Academic scholarship acknowledges the texts but struggles with their claims. The standard interpretation: ancient peoples created elaborate rituals to feel they had control in uncontrollable world. The procedures were psychological comfort, not cosmic operation. The preserved precision reflects cultural importance, not functional necessity. The attribution to divine instruction was rhetorical authorization, not claim about actual transmission. But this interpretation requires dismissing what the texts explicitly say. It requires assuming Mesopotamians were sophisticated enough to develop complex ritual systems, yet credulous enough to believe those systems work through mechanisms the texts describe. It requires treating their preserved technical literature as accidentally precise, their linguistic specifications as coincidentally detailed, their material requirements as arbitrarily symbolic. The alternative requires different discomfort. It requires taking seriously that Mesopotamian cosmology was internally coherent, that within their framework divine forces were real but operated through structure. That structure permitted intervention by those with knowledge. That knowledge had been transmitted from divine source, specifically from Enki, who understood cosmic architecture and distributed defensive procedures to humanity despite opposition from divine factions that preferred human limitation. Within this framework, the ritual literature makes sense. The priests possess me, divine decrees, cosmic patterns, authorized procedures. They possessed knowledge of how Mi functioned, transmitted from Apkallu, who served Enki before the flood. They employed both to create effects that included spatial defense, curse dissolution, omen deflection, demon expulsion, and their procedures addressed not only obvious threats, but also divine forces, when those forces became hostile, when divine anger targeted humans, when cosmic structure permitted resistance through proper procedure. The tablet of destinies could be stolen, the Mi could be transferred, divine authority operated through instruments that could change hands. This was not secret knowledge, it was fundamental Mesopotamian cosmology recorded in their myths, embedded in their rituals. And if divine authority was instrumental rather than intrinsic, then the question became, which instruments did gods retain exclusively and which had been distributed to mortals who needed them to function? The ritual texts answer, much had been distributed. Protective procedures, purification techniques, deflection mechanisms, binding formulae. Not unlimited power, humans remained limited, but sufficient capability, enough to defend consecrated space, enough to dissolve attachable curses, enough to avert omens before manifestation, enough to survive in cosmos where divine forces were powerful, real, and not unified in their intentions toward humanity. This is what the priesthood preserved. Not comfort, but capability. Not theatre, but technique. Knowledge that came with extraordinary claim, that cosmic structure, properly understood, permitted human operation even against divine will, when that will operated through patterns that knowledge could engage procedurally. The evidence sits in fragments. K2950 with its 8-tablet burning procedure, CBS 1673 with its flood memory and Enki's warning, the B.T. Rimke spatial defense manuals, the Urpu purification series, the Namburbi fate deflection texts, thousands of ritual tablets preserved because they were too important to lose, copied across centuries because they remained functional, transmitted through civilizational collapse because the knowledge was necessary for survival. Modern skepticism sees primitive superstition, but the texts describe something more sophisticated, systematic engagement with cosmos, understood as structured, lawful, operating according to principles that even gods respected because the principles were fundamental to cosmic operation itself. The gods were powerful, but power operated through system, and system created opportunities for those who understood its architecture. Enki understood. Enki taught through the Apkallu. The priesthood preserved what the Apkallu transmitted, and that preservation included uncomfortable knowledge that divine authority, while vast, was not absolute. That cosmic structure permitted resistance through proper procedure. That fate could be read and sometimes modified. That curses could be dissolved. That divine forces could be deflected when they approached through channels that defensive procedures could block. This is inheritance we can still read. The tablets remain. The cuneiform is decipherable. The procedures are preserved with precision that testifies to their perceived importance. And the framework they reveal challenges comfortable narratives about helpless ancients before omnipotent gods. The Mesopotamians understood themselves differently as inheritors of antediluvian knowledge, as operators within cosmic structure, as possessors of procedures that gods themselves, specifically Enki, had distributed for purposes that included human survival even when other divine factions preferred human limitation. They preserved this understanding in clay, in cuneiform that has outlasted their cities, their language, their civilization itself. What remains is testimony, evidence of religious culture that understood authority as structured, knowledge as transferable, operation as possible for those properly trained, evidence that divine power, while real, functioned within cosmic architecture that permitted intervention, evidence that priests possessed not merely faith but technique, systematic procedures for engaging forces that claimed divine authority and achieving effects through knowledge rather than through helpless supplication. The tablets wait in climate-controlled vaults. The procedures remain readable to specialists who can pass Sumerian and Akkadian. The knowledge is preserved, no longer practiced, but still present, still testifying to what ancient priesthood believed it could accomplish through proper training, proper materials, proper execution of procedures inherited from beings who understood cosmic structure from inside. This is what Sumerian texts reveal, not proof of ancient astronauts or alien intervention, but something perhaps more challenging, evidence that ancient peoples developed sophisticated frameworks for understanding divine power as real but structured, as vast but not unlimited, as operating through principles that knowledge could engage. Evidence that priesthood understood itself as possessing defensive capability against cosmic forces that included divine channels. Evidence that this capability was preserved, transmitted, guarded as civilization's most essential inheritance. The fire that burned in Makul ceremonies went cold millennia ago. The houses defended through Bitrimki procedures crumbled into archaeological tells. The curses addressed by Urpu were dissolved or found their targets centuries before present. The practice ended, the civilization fell, but the knowledge remains, impressed in clay that has survived everything that destroyed the culture that created it. Readable still, testifying still, challenging still our comfortable assumptions about what ancient peoples believed, what they claimed they could accomplish, what knowledge they preserved from sources they identified as divine instruction, deliberately transmitted to ensure human capability in cosmos where divine forces were. Powerful but not unified, real but not absolute, dangerous but potentially resistible through proper procedure executed by those who possess the knowledge. The tablets remain, and with them remains the question, what did they know that we have forgotten? Not because we lack their tablets, we have thousands, but because we lack their framework, their willingness to take cosmic structure seriously as operating through principle rather than arbitrary power, their understanding that knowledge, once transmitted, creates capability that even those who transmitted it cannot fully revoke. Enki spoke to a wall. The knowledge survived the flood. The priesthood preserved what the Apkallu taught. And what they preserved, now scattered across museums worldwide, is testament to religious culture that understood resistance not as rebellion, but as operation, systematic, procedural, authorized by divine source that favoured human capability enough to distribute knowledge that made capability possible. The texts reveal, the title's promise fulfilled. Mesopotamian priests knew they preserved what they knew in clay, and that clay remains, bearing witness across millennia to knowledge that challenges, that unsettles, that refuses to fit comfortable categories of primitive superstition or helpless faith. They knew how to resist. Through fire, through procedure, through knowledge inherited from before the flood and preserved because survival required it. The tablets testify, and testimony, once written in clay and baked by fire, endures.